Hello everyone and welcome into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show. This should be a good one. Hope you all enjoy Monday Night Football. Very weird game, and that will be our first segment of the day that we're going to be touching upon, just recapping from a fantasy perspective what went down in that game and perhaps the off-field decisions that both of these teams made after the fact. We're going to be looking a little bit around the waiver wire for all those people still trying to figure out how to configure their lineups. Maybe turning to the waiver wire and getting some advice from me will help you in that department. I'm going to continue my positional rankings, my running backs and wide receivers, and we'll conclude today's show with our weekly shadow report, my key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I believe will define the fantasy football weekend. But without further ado, before we get into today's show, I do want to remind you that if you like this kind of content or any short content that we put out for you, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network to keep up to date with all our different shows around the network. It's greatly appreciated by all. But if you want to contribute and interact to shows, especially mine, more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way, like I said, to interact with the show more directly. You can either press the $ that appears on your screen on YouTube to leave a tip or donation, or also just leave a comment if you have any throughout the show. It just makes the show, my fellow shows as well, that much better, as Andres had some big trades today. Sheesh. If we have time during this segment, we will get to them. But I do want to, without further ado, jump into what happened on the field last night between the Buffalo Bills and the New York Jets before we get into all that happened today. This game, if you're just a general football fan, it felt very frustrating to watch because it felt like either the team that won was going to win because they committed less penalties or because their field goal kicker would just kick a game-winning field goal, kick more field goals than the other, because it felt so weird watching fundamental, detail-oriented things go completely awry, and also to see how frustrating it was that officiating, as Andre said, Chris, what do I do with Garrett Wilson, bro? I'm a little scared, haha. Well, we'll talk a little bit about him as well, but we have a lot to discuss here with this game, especially on the fantasy front as well, because in terms of a fantasy perspective, I can't really say anyone truly was a star this game. It was a very efficient game for a lot of these players on both of these teams. It wasn't necessarily like anyone truly wowed. There were a couple people, but no one truly stole the game from a fantasy perspective. Least of all, Garrett Wilson, who's now on the outside looking in, a little bit of foreshadowing for what we could be talking about towards the end of this segment. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the fantasy side of things in this game. Overall, efficient play from both teams. Nothing too fancy. For the Jets, we saw a couple things that we wanted to see out of them in terms of getting the running game more involved, in terms of more pre-snap motions. And it was a pretty decent game, sans Robert Saleh. On the Bills side of things, they really found a new star in Ray Davis at the running back position. Just goes to show how crowded that running back room could be and how vital it could be down the stretch. But overall, not the prettiest of wins for them. But in terms of fantasy, I'll give you some key stats. Let's start off with Josh Allen. Pretty humdrum kind of day for him. 19-25, 215 yards, 2 TDs, 24.4 fantasy points. And if those are the kinds of stat lines we see from this new version of Josh Allen from now on, then so be it. Because if it wins the Bills football games, then you shouldn't really be too mad with it, because he's becoming someone who is taking care of the football in such a way that allows him to be someone who is teetering on both superstardom but also just all too natural, competent quarterback play. Because that's what it stems down to. If you can key in on the little details to make yourself look good, then chances are you're doing more things well to win than trying to take too many risks and be too risk-oriented to lead your offense, too quote-unquote Allen-centric, as some people call it. But overall, not too mad, not too bad for Josh Allen, and I'm pretty non-committal about his performance. It's one of those performances in fantasy where you just have to take it how it is. It wasn't anything too pretty. It wasn't anything to really wow you, but it was a vintage Josh Allen protecting the football performance. But then the real star of the day for the Bills on the offensive side of the football in terms of fantasy was Ray Davis, a revelation who we're going to be talking about a lot on the show. 20 carries, 97 yards, 3 receptions, 55 yards, 18.2 fantasy points. Really stepping up in James Cook's absence. Really impressed by him and what he can do for this Bills offense. Should you know, injuries along that backfield factor into what the Bills can and can't do. So the fact that Ray Davis emerged as a potential option behind James Cook is huge for what the Bills want to do offensively. What with, Amari Cooper now in and things of that nature, it could change how they approach the running game, but it's important to note that Ray Davis could be a huge part of that. And then not really many receivers to point out for the Buffalo Bills in this one. But I do want to point out the fact that it seemed that Curtis Samuel seemed to get more touches. And this is definitely going to change going forward because, of course, the Amari Cooper trade. But Curtis Samuel is someone who I wanted to see more out of because he was perhaps the biggest name that the Bills had in their receiver core outside of now and Amari Cooper. But it wasn't really an impressive performance. Only 7.4 fantasy points to show for it and 44 yards. So that's maybe why the Bills decided to go out for Amari Cooper. But if you want my honest opinion about that trade, I'm actually not necessarily swayed by it. Because I feel like the Bills have proved that they have enough in-house options besides also kind of switching over from a more pass-oriented approach to a run-oriented approach to really account for any deficiencies they might find. Because this was a tough physical game. Make no ands, ifs, or buts about it. So the fact that the Bills were able to approach this game in such a way that they were able to win through the run and through physicality should have projected as something that they should hold on to before they go out and make a swing for the fences. Because right now, they're in pole position to win the AFC East as well. If anything, I feel like the Amari Cooper move could be a little bit more important come playoff time because he could be a difference maker then. But I don't see why we would feel rushing this. As honest, I feel like the Bills needed this if they want to make a run. That's an interesting point because from the way I see it, Amari Cooper feels like someone who is going to really help them in the postseason. But from what we've seen of them, they have enough that in the regular season at the very least, they'll be fine because the AFC East is not scary enough for me to say the Bills won't win it. They're certainly going to pick up enough divisional wins. They're certainly going to be in and around the conversation to be at the very least a number 3 seed in the AFC. And ultimately, it looks like Josh Allen, for the most part, has been the most comfortable he's ever been. And if they keep on playing the style like they did against the Jets, then chances are they can beat teams that are in that kind of middle tier in the AFC, like the Jets. And they're going to be facing a lot of them thus far. Their schedule is highly manageable going forward. But then, if you're on the Jets side of things, this game certainly felt a lot more promising than it looked. I feel like a lot of people are going to say, well, the Jets look like the same old Jets we've seen for the past couple of weeks. But there were some nice things mixed in there that gave me optimism if, say, you're a Jets fan watching or just anyone in general who was curious to see how the Jets offense would look, sans Robert Saleh, to show that they have weapons there that they could have utilized all along, which just makes me feel that much more weird about the Devontae Adams trade. But going into the game last night in the fantasy perspective of us all, Aaron Rodgers, perhaps his best game ever as a New York Jet, 23 of 35, almost 294 yards, 2 TDs, 1 interception for a total of 17.76 fantasy points. And, I felt like this showed the level of talent that the Jets have at their disposal if, Aaron Rodgers is willing to distribute the wealth a little bit more. Because we saw moments where, yes, he was tied into receivers he's more comfortable with, like Lazard and Mike Williams. But we also saw a lot more Breece Hall in both the passing and receiving in the running game. And I feel like we saw what this Jets offense could have been like if they didn't go out for Davante Adams and just worked with what they had. And it didn't look too bad. So if I'm, say, Breece Hall or Garrett Wilson, I'm kind of mad at this trade if I'm them. I'm saying we proved before that without Aaron Rodgers, we were competent players in this offensive scheme. So why are we now relying on Aaron Rodgers as the guy to lead us when we have been leading this team to 7-win seasons when we should have won 4 games the past 2 seasons? So that would feel hard done by if I'm either Breece Hall or Garrett Wilson. Not for nothing, Breece Hall had a decent game, 18 carries, 113 yards, 21.9 fantasy points. Saw a lot more out of him. But then, of course, going back to the whole Aaron Rodgers-centric narrative, Allen Lazard had the biggest game of anyone for the Jets receiving core with 6 catches, 114 yards, 1 TD, and 23.4 fantasy points. So the Jets' decision to trade for Davante Adams, I'm not necessarily swayed by, but I still feel like the Jets are stuck between 2 mindsets. Whether or not this is Aaron Rodgers' team to determine what to do with and how to approach the offensive setup and game plan going forward, or if it's the team's will to really come together around Aaron Rodgers and find a way to make different things work. Because if that's the case, then I would have felt much more comfortable with Davante Adams' case. But this feels a little bit too desperate for an offensive performance that proved that you have the pieces there without a big signing at the receiver position to stay afloat at the very least in the AFC East and the AFC playoff race. It's not for nothing. You still very much are in the thick of the AFC playoff race with the Jets. At 2-4, you shouldn't be too scared. So I personally, if I were the Jets GM, would not have gone out and gotten Davante Adams. But I understand if, they are going along the path of we want this to be Aaron Rodgers' team. But if it's not, then this performance and the positive things we've gleaned from it was all for naught then. Because you can't not be frustrated if you're a Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall with this trade when you've been a stalwart of this team for the past couple of years. So in terms of both of these trades off the field, I don't know how much they're going to impact both of these teams, but I certainly feel like both of these teams had enough to do without these trades, and these moves seem a little bit too premature for what we know about these teams and what we've seen from them thus far. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments because it's a very interesting situation. Let me know what you think about the game as well if you so choose. But when we come back on the other side, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some hidden gems out there in the waiver wire. Very interesting week in terms of who could be out there for you in that regard. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about that. Don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?